The following content may include discussions or topics that could be triggering or upsetting to individuals who have experienced similar traumas. Viewer discretion is advised.
There's a place hidden deep within the heart of Scientology, a place few talk about and even fewer understand. It's not listed in public documents, and those who have been there often speak of it in hushed tones. Imagine being cut off from everything you know, your family, your friends, the outside world, forced into grueling labor, all under the belief that it's for your own spiritual salvation. They call it the Rehabilitation Project Force, or RPF, but what really goes on inside? And why are so many former members haunted by its very mention? The truth lies in the shadows of the organization, where redemption, control, and something far more sinister intersect. What secrets are kept within the RPF's walls, and why does the Church of Scientology go to such lengths to hide it from public view? Welcome to the Sins of Scientology. I'm Sandy McKenna, and with my co-host Abraham Orwick, we're about to pull back the curtain on one of Scientology's most tightly guarded secrets. What we're about to uncover will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Stay with us. This episode of Sins of Scientology might just be one of the most revealing yet.
The Sea Organization is an elite Scientology group established by L. Ron Hubbard in 1967. It functions like a religious order with a rigid hierarchical structure, and its members pledge a billion-year commitment to serving the church. Sea Org members are highly dedicated and oversee the most important and sensitive church operations. They often work long hours in exchange for little to no pay and live in communal settings with strict disciplines. The Rehabilitation Project Force, or RPF, was introduced in the mid-1970s as a way to rehabilitate Sea Org members who were deemed to have failed to meet expectations or committed serious infractions or out-ethics behavior. Originally, the RPF was a disciplinary program aimed at improving the spiritual condition of those members who had lost favor with leadership or displayed counterproductive behavior. L. Ron Hubbard introduced the RPF as a part of a broader approach to discipline within the Sea Org. The program's foundation was his belief that Sea Org members who were not upholding the organization's rigorous standards needed an intensive form of spiritual rehabilitation to restore their usefulness. The RPF was designed to be a place where out-ethics Sea Org members, those seen as failing to meet the ethical or productivity standards, could be re-educated. Those sent to the RPF would be assigned menial and labor-intensive tasks, such as cleaning and construction, often under harsh physical conditions. Alongside these tasks, they underwent auditing, Scientology's form of spiritual counseling, and were required to write extensive confessions of their wrongdoings. The RPF program was meant to be a form of atonement and spiritual renewal, allowing the members to reintegrate into the Sea Org once they had proven their rehabilitation. The RPF was initially a maritime program aboard Scientology ships, but eventually expanded to on-land facilities as the Sea Org's presence grew. Participants were expected to undergo this grueling process for months or even years, depending on their progress. Sea Org members in the RPF were required to work long hours, performing physically demanding tasks such as cleaning and construction. At the same time, they were isolated from other Sea Org members in society, and they had limited communication with their families. They also had to undergo re-education through continuous auditing sessions aimed at addressing their transgressions and bringing them back in line with Scientology's expectations. RPF members were segregated from the general Sea Org population, sometimes forced to wear black boiler suits to mark their lower status. Sleeping quarters and food were often substandards compared to those of regular Sea Org members, and the conditions were designed to be harsh as part of the rehabilitation process. The Church of Scientology officially describes the RPF as a voluntary program designed for the spiritual rehabilitation and improvement of Sea Org members. According to the Church's narrative, The RPF is an opportunity for individuals to reflect on their ethical lapses, undergo spiritual counseling, and perform useful work while working towards their own redemption. The Church maintains that the RPF is entirely voluntary, where participants can leave at any time. Scientology promotes the RPF as a pathway for personal growth and spiritual progress, positioning it as a chance to correct personal failings and realign with the greater goal of the Church. Scientology emphasizes that the RPF is not a punishment, but rather a method of spiritual repair. Let's listen to former Scientologist and actress Leah Remini.
Leah says things came to a head when she and Nicole were brought up on ethics charges for their involvement with boys.
I allowed my boyfriend at the time, who was like my first boyfriend, to go like this over my shirt.
And that was enough to get you...
And that was light. That was very light. It wasn't like real. It wasn't a real grab, Dan. Like,
very hard to have this discussion with a straight face. But we're laughing about this, but the people in Scientology were not laughing about it.
No, I wasn't laughing at it either at the time.
It was a serious violation, and Leah says the church ethics officers threatened to put her and her sister into what's called the Rehabilitation Project Force, a place for Scientologists who step out of line.
When you have screwed up royally in the Sea Org, it's basically to reform you. You have to wear black. You have to run everywhere you go. You have to call everyone sir. It's pretty severe punishment for an adult, not to mention a child.
Let's paint a vivid and raw picture of what life was like inside the RPF. This environment often felt more like a prison than a place of spiritual rehabilitation. Imagine waking up before sunrise, knowing you'll face another day of grueling, backbreaking work. Sea Org members assigned to the RPF were required to work up to 12, sometimes even 14 hours a day, under conditions that most people would find unbearable. These tasks ranged from construction to cleaning, maintenance of church properties, and other physically demanding jobs. Members were expected to perform these duties regardless of the weather or their physical state. There was no room for complaint, whether it was blistering hot or freezing cold. Sleep was a luxury that members rarely experienced. After long hours of labor, they were lucky to get more than 5 or 6 hours of rest, often in cramped, uncomfortable sleeping quarters. It was common to sleep in makeshift dormitories with cots or even sleeping bags thrown together in small spaces. Privacy was non-existent. Food was sparse, with meals provided at odd hours and usually consisting of bare minimum to keep them going. RPF members were often served a meager diet, sometimes eating leftover or substandard food compared to what higher-ranking Sea Org members were given. And while they toiled away, there was little to no communication with the outside world, family, or even other Sea Org members who were not in the RPF. The RPF has often been compared to a prison system with forced labor. Participants were assigned to the most menial and physically exhausting tasks as part of their rehabilitation. These tasks included building and maintaining church facilities, cleaning, manual labor, and even jobs like hauling debris or scrubbing floors, work often performed under the watchful eye of supervisors who made sure no one slacked off. In some cases, RPF members were responsible for the upkeep of the properties that the church used for public-facing activities, but they were rarely seen by those outside the RPF. Many former participants recall being hidden from public view, almost like they were being punished in secret. Here's a clip from MythVision TV with former Scientology executive and author of The Billion-Year Contract, Mike Rinder.
The hole has been one of the sore spots, no matter how far away you are from the hole and the crawling around on your knees and the whole nine. You being a fundamentalist, you're going to believe, but enough is enough. And so can you tell us how bad the torture, how bad the prison, how bad was this hole, and maybe how you got out?
Well, it was pretty damn bad. I equate it to like the Lord of the Flies. It was an environment where Scientology executives had been locked up in these 2 double-wide trailers. The windows were screwed shut so that they only open an inch and nobody could get out of them. All 3 doors were barred except one front entrance, which had a 24-hour-a-day security guard posted. Nobody was allowed to leave. There were no showers. You ate, slept, worked, fought, beat one another up, all in the same place. I slept under a table or a desk, same desk where I ate the slop that they brought up that was left over from the main crew food, the same place that we would sit, try and beat confessions out of other people. And it was a dog-eat-dog world. Like I said, Lord of the Flies. The idea being everybody who was in there was some incorrigible criminal in the eyes of David Miscavige and had been confined to this hole, that the only way out was to confess your sins, that a big plus for anybody that was in there was getting other people to confess their sins. And so it devolved into physical abuse of people to try and force them to admit to things that probably they'd never even did. But the more salacious the admission, the better it was for the person who managed to force the admission out of them. So you have enormous amounts of things that people have in their own handwriting that were in the hole, admitting to the most outrageous crimes. I mean, Scientology pulls these out all the time. Anybody that was there who is now speaking out, Scientology comes out and says, oh, yes, you can see in his own handwriting, Mike Rinder admits to having lied repeatedly. He lied. Amy Scobie admits to having blah, blah, blah. Tom DeVock admits to having blah, blah, blah. Mark Headley admits blah, blah, blah. These forced confessions no better than the POW videos from North Korea. They are what you feel you end up having to do in order to somehow get yourself out of this nightmare that you have found yourself in.
The isolation was suffocating. Members of the RPF were often kept separated from the rest of the Sea Org and broader church population, cut off not only from the outside world, but also from their fellow Scientologists. There was no casual interaction. They were forbidden from speaking to anyone outside of their immediate work group without permission. Communication was minimal within their assigned groups, and they were often discouraged from discussing their experiences or feelings. This led to deep loneliness and helplessness that compounded the already harsh conditions. The physical toll of the RPF was enormous. Long hours and physical labor under strict supervision wore down participants both physically and mentally. Members worked through injuries and exhaustion, knowing that showing any signs of weakness could lead to further punishment. There were stories of individuals who pushed themselves beyond their limits just to avoid falling behind or being seen as out ethics. But the psychological toll was perhaps even more severe. Those in the RPF underwent daily auditing sessions, an intense form of interrogation where they were expected to confess their crimes and transgressions against Scientology. These sessions were designed to break down psychological resistance, with auditors probing deep into their personal lives, often for hours. Many participants described these sessions as invasive, emotionally draining, and psychologically demanding. Fundamental rights were stripped away. Freedom of movement was tightly controlled, with members needing permission to go anywhere, even to the bathroom. Personal autonomy became a distant memory as every aspect of life was dictated by those in charge. There were reports of members being watched constantly, even while they slept, and of strict surveillance that created a constant sense of paranoia. One of the most harrowing aspects of the RPF was the stripping away of communication. Participants couldn't call their families, couldn't write letters, and certainly couldn't leave to visit anyone. This isolation was particularly devastating for those with children or spouses outside the Sea Org, as they were cut off completely with no idea how their loved ones were doing. For many, this led to long-term emotional trauma, as they not only lost touch with the outside world, but felt a deep sense of abandonment. Many former RPF participants have spoken about the long-lasting psychological damage they endured. Depression, anxiety, and PTSD were common among those who went through the program. Some even compare the RPF to a form of psychological torture as they were pushed to their mental and emotional limits with no way out except through compliance and submission.
The story of the RPF doesn't end with the harrowing accounts of those who lived through it. Over the years, the program has sparked intense legal battles and international scrutiny, as many have raised questions about its ethics, legality, and human rights violations. The RPF has been at the center of numerous lawsuits, many of which have revolved around the allegations of forced labor, unlawful imprisonment, and human rights abuses. One of the major issues in these legal battles is that Scientology, like many religious organizations in the United States, is afforded certain protections under the First Amendment, which safeguards religious freedom. Because the RPF is presented by the Church as a voluntary religious program for spiritual rehabilitation, the Church has been able to shield itself from many lawsuits under the argument that these were religious practices. In several cases, courts have dismissed lawsuits against Scientology by ruling that the RPF fell within the Church's right to manage its internal religious affairs. However, this hasn't stopped former members from pursuing justice. Some lawsuits have led to settlements, often with non-disclosure agreements attached, preventing the details from being made public. In these settlements, there is typically no admission of wrongdoing on the part of Scientology, but the payments to former members suggest that there is substance to the claims of abuse and forced labor. One of the most prominent cases involving the RPF was brought by Claire Headley, a former Sea Org member. In 2009, Claire filed a lawsuit against the Church of Scientology, claiming she had been subjected to forced labor while in the RPF. She described long hours, harsh conditions, and psychological coercion as part of her experience. Here's an excerpt from an interview that Claire did with Shali Sansola from Cults to Consciousness about her time in the hole for the RPF.
And then I ended up in the hole.
You did?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell everybody what that means?
Yep. So it was these double wide trailers on the property where all the management executives were essentially being, they were locked up, not allowed to leave. To my knowledge, there's probably still some version of that in play today, probably not in those same buildings because there's been so many people talk about it. Like Mike Rinder was there for 2 years after I left. It was bad when I was there, but it got significantly worse, like absolutely worse. Everyone that was in the hole was essentially being accused of non-performing and having counterintention to David Miscavige and not wanting Scientology to survive or prevail or whatever. And so the reason I was put there is because I refused to divorce Mark, and then I was not allowed to go home anymore. I was sleeping on the floor of my office in a sleeping bag. Anyway, it was a complete nightmare.
But it wasn't just Claire. Her husband, Mark Headley, also sued Scientology around the same time. Mark had worked at Scientology's Gold Base, and like Claire, he alleged human rights violations and abuse during his time in the Sea Org. Together, their cases highlighted serious issues with forced labor and labor law violations within Scientology. However, the Ninth Circuit Court ruled in favor of the Church. The court found the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom prevented them from interfering with Scientology's internal practices, including the working conditions of Sea Org members. Essentially, the court decided that because Claire and Mark had voluntarily joined the Sea Org, their experiences fell under the Church's religious discipline. Then there's the story of Laura DiCrescenzo, a young woman who joined the Sea Org when she was just 12 years old and later took on the Church of Scientology in court. Imagine being a child of hope and belief and suddenly finding yourself thrust into a world where obedience is everything. That's what happened to Laura. She was barely a teenager when she was forced into the infamous RPF. But Laura's story doesn't stop there. By the time she was 17, she says the Church pressured her into having an abortion. Now, here's the thing. In the Sea Org, Having kids is a huge no-no. The church doesn't want its more loyal workers, the people they rely on for endless hours of service, distracted by things like raising a family. Laura claimed that she was told in no uncertain terms that having a baby wasn't an option for her. So, feeling trapped, she went through with it. Fast forward to 2009. Laura had finally managed to leave Scientology, and she wasn't about to let what happened to her stay in the shadows. She filed a lawsuit against the Church of Scientology International, and it wasn't just about the abortion. She laid out some heavy allegations: being forced into labor as a minor, confined against her will, and subjected to mental manipulation. She was asking the courts to see what was happening inside Scientology's RPF as violations of labor laws and basic human rights. As you can probably guess, the church didn't take this lightly. They fought back hard. Their defense? They said everything Laura went through was part of her religious practice, protected by the First Amendment. And believe it or not, this is often how Scientology has protected itself in court, by saying that what happens inside the church is part of their beliefs and religious discipline. But this case took a different turn. At one point, a judge ordered the church to release thousands of pages of internal documents about Laura's time in the Sea Org. This was a big deal. These are the kinds of documents the church guards fiercely. But there they were, forced to hand them over, providing a rare glimpse into how they operate behind closed doors. After nearly 10 years of back and forth legal battles and multiple appeals, Laura's case was finally settled in 2018. Now, here's where it gets frustrating. The settlement was for an undisclosed amount, and like many settlements, it didn't result in any formal ruling or precedent. So while Laura did get some form of justice, the full truth of her experience and Scientology's internal workings remains mostly sealed. But what this case really brought to light was how the church uses things like the RPF to control its members, and how difficult it is for former members to fight back, even when their claims are as severe as Laura's. Her story sheds light on the trauma and abuses that so many others have likely endured, but haven't had the chance or the strength to speak out about it. Beyond the U.S. legal system, the RPF has attracted global attention, particularly from human rights organizations. Many of these organizations have drawn uncomfortable comparisons between the conditions inside the RPF and those found in forced labor camps. Groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have expressed concern over the reports of harsh treatment, lack of freedom, and the psychological toll on participants. One of the most damning criticisms came from the United Nations, which in response to growing reports of abuse, investigated claims of human trafficking within Scientology. While the church categorically denied these accusations, former RPF members have likened their experiences to being trafficked, as they were often held in the program against their will, forced to work without pay, and isolated from the outside world. The UN had looked into these allegations, though no formal action had been taken against the church internationally. Other international bodies, particularly in Europe, have also criticized the RPF. Several countries, such as Germany and France, have taken a hard stance against Scientology, citing its practices as abusive and cult-like. In these countries, the RPF is seen as a human rights violation, with many equating it to a form of modern-day slavery. This view has led to calls for stricter regulations on the church and for more rigorous investigations into its practices, particularly those surrounding the RPF and the other disciplinary programs within the Sea Org. While Scientology continued to defend the RPF as a voluntary and religious program, the mounting criticism from human rights organizations, coupled with numerous legal challenges, casts a long shadow of the program's true nature. For many, the RPF represented not spiritual rehabilitation, but rather an environment where basic human rights were routinely violated.
When examining the RPF, it's impossible to ignore the disturbing parallels between its practices and the system of forced labor and psychological control seen in other cults and authoritarian regimes. The RPF, though wrapped in the language of religious rehabilitation, bears striking similarities to how groups throughout history have used coercion, punishment, and re-education to maintain control over their followers. Many cults and authoritarian systems have employed forced labor as a tool for control. The RPF functions similarly to how cults or regimes use isolation and hard labor to strip individuals of their autonomy. Whether it's in a religious cult, political dictatorships, or military-style organizations, the strategy is often the same: to break down individuals both physically and psychologically through exhausting labor and strict supervision. Let's examine this clip of former Scientologists speaking out on the abuses of Scientology.
The fun stops for these children with failure and disobedience. By 1976, on instructions from Hubbard, the first children's RPF was established in Los Angeles. No time off for play, but a children's prison camp with absolute obedience as its goal. One of the reasons for the camp for children was stated in this document: make it clear to the children that any form of vandalism, theft, and any other crime committed by a child will be punished by the RPF under aggravated conditions.
Forget about your kids. Forget about even talking to your own child that might be in a different area of the Sea Org. No communication is allowed. You are isolated like a leper colony, and you are considered a disgraced Sea Org member.
It was completely abusive and had no other purpose than to dominate and control people and make buckets of money.
Valeska Paris left the Freewinds when she was sent to the Rehabilitation Project Force in Sydney. Scientologists describe the RPF as a voluntary religious retreat. Defectors describe it as a punitive re-education camp. It was here she met former St George Rugby League captain Chris Guyder, soon after they got married and left the church. Valeska Paris says she'd like to see the head of the Church of Scientology, the man who she says sent her to the Freewinds, put on trial.
It's not right for someone to be running the church and basically take advantage of, a church and hiding behind religion to live like a king and to abuse people around him. That man doesn't like anyone. He's a psychopath.
7 days a week, 6 had long days,
rock hauling, hauling them up the hill, putting them in a pile, and we would do this no matter how hot or how cold it was outside.
15 hours a day. We worked 7 days a week. I maybe had 2 or 3 days off a year.
There's been many times when I've tried to leave the room and they physically held me in there.
His viciousness and his cruelty to staff was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my life.
I saw David Miscavige physically strike somebody or punch in the face at least 30 different occasions of that. He punched me in the face at least 10 times. To be beaten by the leader of my so-called church, I could go no further down than this.
In the RPF, participants are subjected to long hours and intense physical labor under the guise of spiritual improvement, just as members of other cults have been forced to work for the benefit of their leaders or the group as a whole. The tasks are deliberately designed to be menial and degrading, reinforcing the power dynamics between the instructor and the supervisor and those being rehabilitated. This type of work serves a dual purpose, keeping participants physically exhausted and mentally pliable while reinforcing their sense of dependency on the group for redemption. The use of isolation in the RPF is another hallmark of cult control tactics. Just as some cults cut their members off from friends, family, and the outside world, the RPF isolates its participants from both the wider church and society at large. This isolation ensures that only voices they hear are those of the organization, which gradually erodes their critical thinking skills and makes them more susceptible to the re-education process. The RPF doesn't just rely on physical labor to maintain control, it employs a range of psychological control techniques that have been observed in other authoritarian systems. One of the most powerful tools is coercive persuasion, a form of psychological manipulation where participants are subjected to intense scrutiny and pressure to conform. In the RPF, this happens through relentless auditing sessions. Individuals are grilled on their perceived wrongdoings until they confess, even if they have nothing to confess. These sessions serve to break down resistance and reprogram the individual to accept the church's narratives of their failures. Surveillance is another tactic. Members of the RPF are often watched closely, whether it's during their work tasks, their interactions with others, or even in their limited moments of rest. This constant oversight creates a sense of paranoia where participants know they are being monitored at all times. The lack of privacy and the fear of punishment for the slightest infraction keeps them in line. The RPF's system of reward and punishment also serves to recondition individuals. Those who comply and who show progress in their rehabilitation are given small privileges, while those who resist or fall behind are punished, either with additional labor or more intense isolation. This mirrors the psychological control techniques seen in other cult-like environments, where members are manipulated through a combination of fear, isolation, and conditional approval. One of the most surprising and unsettling aspects of life inside the RPF is how some participants, even after enduring harsh and abusive conditions, develop a sense of loyalty or attachment to their captors. This phenomenon is known as the Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological response where captives begin to identify and even defend those who are oppressing them. In the case of the RPF, former members have recounted how they sometimes came to believe that the program was truly for their own good. Despite the forced labor, isolation, and psychological manipulation, some individuals found themselves justifying the church's actions, convinced that they deserved the punishment and needed the rehabilitation to be spiritually cleansed. This mindset is a powerful testament to the psychological control that the RPF exerts on its participants. Stockholm Syndrome develops when individuals, deprived of their basic freedoms and autonomy, come to see their captors as their only source of validation or approval. In the isolated, tightly controlled environment of the RPF, participants may feel that their only chance of survival or redemption is through compliance and loyalty to those who are controlling them. Over time, this creates a deep emotional dependency on the very people who are inflicting harm. For some former RPF members, it took years to fully understand the extent of the manipulation they had endured. Many have spoken about how difficult it was to leave the program, not just because of the physical and emotional barriers, but because they had been conditioned to believe that leaving would be a failure, that they wouldn't survive outside the confines of the church's control.
As we look to the current state of the RPF in 2024, the picture is far from clear. Scientology, known for its secrecy and tight control of information, hasn't officially announced the closure or the continuation of the RPF. However, rumors and conflicting reports from former members suggest that while the RPF may not exist in the exact form it did decades ago, similar practices are likely to continue under different guises. The RPF, as it was originally conceived back in the 1970s, may not be as openly active today, but it has yet to entirely disappear. Scientology as a religious organization adapts its practices to avoid public scrutiny. Officially, the church has claimed that the RPF is a voluntary program for those seeking spiritual rehabilitation, and there's little outward sign of it being enforced as rigorously as it once was. However, former Sea Org members who have left Scientology in recent years report that versions of the RPF still exist, though under less visible structures.
Growing up in Scientology's Aaron Smith Levin gives some insight into David Miscavige's changes to the RPF.
The RPF was just really bad PR. And a lot of the troubles that Scientology was encountering legally, most of them were coming from people who had left the Sea Org from the RPF or who had left the Sea Org shortly after doing the RPF. The RPF is so abusive. It is so inhumane. It is so destructive to an individual mentally, physically, spiritually, that it just didn't make any sense. And also, when somebody was leaving the Sea Org from the RPF, it would require so many more man hours behind the scenes on backlines to go through their folders, go through their auditing folders, go through the ethics folders, figure out what this person might know or have experienced that could come back to hurt the church later on. That it was like, oh man, we got to get rid of this headache. We got to get rid of the RPF. It's out PR. It's bad PR. But Miscavige couldn't very well just issue an order that says the RPF is out PR, so we're going to cancel it. I know it might seem like perhaps he could do that, but that would not allow him to save face, because who allowed it to get out PR? Who allowed the RPF to evolve into something that was nothing even similar to what it was when L. Ron Hubbard created it? Well, David Miscavige did. Who is it that has treated the RPF essentially like a concentration camp? David Miscavige is the one. So he needed a face saver. And the face saver was the golden age of tech. That was 2013, even though there had been almost no RPF assignments for years leading up to 2013. After that, that was the face saver he needed.
Some ex-members suggest that the church has become more careful about openly maintaining programs like the RPF, especially in the wake of increased public awareness, legal challenges, and negative media attention. Instead of formal RPF assignments, similar methods of isolation, forced labor, and psychological control may be happening in more discreet ways. Former insiders say these disciplinary programs are now likely kept behind closed doors and are more difficult to track or document. While there are fewer public stories of RPF-like programs, it's not because they no longer exist. Instead, Scientology seems to have adapted, using different names or reshaped methods to achieve the same goals of controlling and re-educating members who fall out of favor or are seen as out ethics. Although it's been more challenging to find detailed recent accounts of the RPF since 2020, there have been some leaks from ex-Scientologists that provide insights into how the church may be continuing these practices in less overt ways. In particular, some reports indicate that while the RPF might not be as frequently used, disciplinary measures within the Sea Org remain intense and secretive. Former members who left in the early 2020s described the culture where those who defy leadership or fail to meet the strict expectations of the Sea Org are still subjected to isolation and forced labor. However, these programs are carried out in more remote and lesser-known locations far from the scrutiny of public eyes or media attention. Some have reported that the same repressive tactics, such as confessions, hard labor, and limited communication with the outside world, continue, but with a modern twist to avoid legal repercussions. The move to quiet these practices may also be part of Scientology's strategy to present a cleaner, more publicly acceptable face while keeping its internal mechanisms of control intact. The Sea Org, despite its appearance of discipline and dedication, has always operated with a degree of secrecy, and the RPF, or whatever it's evolved into, is likely still an integral part of that.
As we close this episode, we need to take a moment to reflect on everything we've discussed. The RPF, with its history of forced labor, isolation, and psychological manipulation, raises profound questions about how such abuses can go unpunished under the guise of religion. It's a system that has been shielded by the legal protections of religious freedom, leaving many to wonder, how can these practices continue unchecked in a society that prides itself on human rights and justice? How can these abuses go unpunished? One of the most troubling aspects of the RPF is how it has been allowed to exist for so long. Religious organizations, including Scientology, are often protected by laws that allow them to govern their own internal practices, so long as they fall under the category of religious discipline. But where do we draw the line? At what point does spiritual rehabilitation cross over into human rights abuse? These are the questions that courts, legislators, and human rights advocates have wrestled with for years, and yet the RPF remains a gray area in terms of legal accountability. The shield of religion has been used as a powerful defense. The church frames the RPF as voluntary, as an internal disciplinary tool to help members spiritually correct themselves. But the stories from former members tell a different story. Darker truth, a truth of coercion, psychological trauma, and sometimes physical harm. As listeners, we must ask ourselves, why isn't more being done? What should be done to protect Sea Org members? Another critical question is, what can we as a society do to protect those still trapped in similar situations? We know from former members that the RPF, or versions of it, likely exist in some form. So how can we ensure that those within Scientology, particularly vulnerable Sea Org members, are not subjected to further harm? There needs to be greater transparency, more legal oversight, and a way to hold organizations accountable when they cross the line into abuse. Part of the challenge is that those inside the C organization may not feel they have any way out. The isolation, the psychological manipulation, and the total control that the church holds over its members make it incredibly difficult to escape, let alone speak out. So how do we create safe spaces for people to come forward? How do we support those brave enough to leave and ensure they get the help they need? These are questions without easy answers, but are crucial for us to consider. I want to leave you all with a call to action. If this episode resonates with you, please share it. Help spread awareness about what is happening behind closed doors in organizations like Scientology. The more people who understand the darker side of these methods, the greater the chance of change. We need to shine a light on what has been hidden for so long. And if you want to do more, educate yourself further. There are resources available from former members, advocacy groups, and legal experts who are fighting to expose these abuses. You can be part of that change by sharing what you've learned, raising awareness, and supporting those who have lived through these experiences. In the end, it's about justice. It's about ensuring that no one under the guise of religion or otherwise is subjected to the kinds of treatment we've discussed today. I am Abraham Orwick, and together with Sandy McKenna, we want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Sense of Scientology. We hope the insights we've shared left you as intrigued and reflective as we were in uncovering them. If you found this episode impactful, we'd love for you to subscribe, share, and leave a review. And don't forget to follow us on social media to stay updated on our next deep dive into the hidden truths lurking in Scientology's shadowy past. Until then, keep questioning, keep seeking, and may your journey be as rich and enlightening as the stories you encounter.